saw split from groin to skull. In the grim heart of the medieval town, where stone streets echoed with the cries of merchants and beggars alike, there existed a punishment so feared that its mere mention could still the chatter of the marketplace. The saw, a cruel device of iron and wood, a tool of both justice and terror, designed not for swift death but for prolonged agony. Chroniclers of the age speak of it in hushed tones, their parchment yellowed with age, their ink smeared as if touched by the blood they sought to describe. Yet even their words fail to capture the horror, for it was not a mere execution. It was a slow unmaking, a deliberate unraveling of the body while the soul quivered within. The condemned was not a mere number, but a man. They called him Roland, a thief of the smallest sort, yet accused in the court of a heinous crime against the church. In the eyes of the law, he had violated both man and God. In the eyes of the people, he was already damned. On the morning of his execution, the town gathered, though the market square had emptied, leaving only those who had come to witness or to warn themselves against sin. Children were pulled behind skirts, mothers whispered prayers, and men averted their gaze. Even the birds seemed to hang in the air, silent, as if nature itself recognized the abomination that awaited. Roland was dragged from the prison, his feet shuffling through mud and refuse. His hands were bound behind his back, wrists raw from rope, fingers stiff with fear. His eyes darted over the crowd, seeking pity, mercy, anything to halt the inevitable. The magistrates walked before him, faces impassive beneath hoods, their robes brushing the stones with solemn authority. Behind them trailed the executioner, a man of broad shoulders and thick arms, the saw slung across his back. It was not the sort of saw one used for wood. This was an enormous iron contraption, teeth jagged, blackened by fire, with handles on either side, glinting even in the dim morning light. Its design was merciless, its purpose clear. The platform had been erected at the center of the square, a crude scaffold reinforced with thick timbers. Chains hung from hooks, ready to bind the victim, and the saw rested in its cradle, polished and ready, as though it anticipated the screams it would soon orchestrate. The executioner gestured to Roland, and he was forced onto the platform, his knees trembling, his stomach tightening as the reality pressed in. A hood was placed over his head, the coarse fabric scratching against his cheeks, and the magistrate intoned the words of sentencing. The crowd grew silent, the weight of expectation heavy. Death was coming, but not quietly, not without ritual, not without suffering. Roland's heart pounded as the executioner approached. The saw, cold and unyielding, was lifted and placed against the marks of his thighs. The man's hands, though steady, were not merciful. A deep breath, a pause, and the saw bit. The first cut was shallow, slicing through skin and sinew, drawing a gasp that seemed to ripple through the crowd. The smell of iron filled the air, mingling with the morning fog and the distant stench of refuse. Roland's knees buckled, but the chains held him upright. The teeth of the saw ground into flesh, tearing, pulling, shredding. Pain radiated in waves, sharp and unrelenting, as the executioner's rhythm drove the iron deeper. Screams tore from Roland's throat, muffled by the hood, echoing off stone walls and reaching every corner of the square. Time became meaningless. Minutes felt like hours. Every stroke of the saw was a world of agony, a universe where the body betrayed the will. The crowd looked on, some turning away, some unable to tear their eyes from the spectacle. Even hardened men whispered prayers, their hands trembling. The magistrates remained impassive, though the chroniclers would later note the subtle tightening of their jaws, the glimmer of unease in their eyes. This was justice, but it was also revelation. the absolute dominion of the law, the frailty of flesh, the certainty of death. The saw was methodical, relentless. Muscles tore, blood sprayed in dark rivulets down Roland's legs, soaking the timbers beneath him. He clawed at the chains, fingers slick with his own gore, but the iron held him fast. Voices rose in chants, half prayers, half cries of horror. Some among the people had lost themselves in fascination, witnessing suffering as one might study a storm or a wildfire. Others wept, some fainted, and the children stared wide-eyed, mouths agape. No one could deny the lesson being carved before them. Sin demanded payment, and the body was the ledger. As the saw drove upward, inch by inch, it met the pelvis and then the ribcage. Pain beyond description seared through Roland, and yet consciousness clung stubbornly. It was not an end that came quickly. It was a teaching, an unholy pedagogy in the most basic terms of flesh and bone. The executioner's strength never wavered. The blade bit, ground, and tore, and the square became a cathedral of horror, the screams a grotesque choir. The smell of blood was thick, coppery, and sharp, and the flies that circled in the heat of the day began to settle on exposed tissue, small witnesses to a slow and cruel justice. Some chroniclers of the time wrote that as the body split, the soul did not depart. It lingered, trapped in agony, forced to observe its own dissolution. And in that square, beneath the gray skies and the watchful eyes of God and man, Roland's humanity was stripped, layer by layer. The sound of the saw striking bone was different from that of flesh. High, rasping, a rasp that seemed to pierce the air itself. It was the sound of inevitability. And yet, despite the pain, despite the knowledge of what awaited, Roland's mind did not leave entirely. He thought of home, of the small comforts of life before crime, of the warmth of bread, the softness of a pillow. These memories were cruel taunts, brief lights in a landscape of horror. The process continued until finally, there was nothing left but a broken, shredded figure suspended by chains, limbs splayed impossibly, head bowed in defeat. The crowd was silent now, the echo of screams fading into a reverent hush. Some fell to their knees, some crossed themselves, and some simply stared, unable to comprehend the magnitude of suffering. The magistrates pronounced the execution complete. The body was left displayed for hours, a warning to all who might consider transgression. The iron saw was cleaned, its teeth sharpened once more, ready for the next lesson in mortality. In the aftermath, the square was quiet but for the drip of blood onto stones and the cries of those who had fainted or wept. The smell lingered, clinging to garments and hair, a memento of the spectacle. Traders returned, children resumed play, and the rhythm of town life continued, as though the horror had been a single note in a vast, indifferent symphony. But the memory endured. Tales of the saw spread to neighboring villages, whispered in taverns and marketplaces. A warning of law, of divine justice, and of the fragility of flesh. Chroniclers would later describe Roland as both sinner and victim, a man caught between the will of God and the authority of men. His screams, his agony, his slow unmaking, these became lessons, morality tales carved in flesh. And long after the timber of the scaffold rotted, long after the saw itself had dulled with age, the story of that day persisted. It was recounted to children to teach obedience, to adults to teach caution, to the faithful to illustrate the stark dominion of law and the certainty of divine and mortal retribution. Thus the saw remained in memory, not merely as a device, but as a symbol, of justice rendered with unflinching cruelty, of the horrors that lie in wait for those who break the covenant of law, and of the inexorable march of death that spares neither sin nor fear. And in the square, where stones still bear faint stains, The wind sometimes carries a whisper, perhaps a ghostly echo of that final, terrible cry, reminding the living that flesh is fragile, pain is endless, and the saw waits for none.